here at DMAS, or ARM will be the acronym that we'll be using for that. I appreciate you attending the workshop today. You were asked to attend as you've been identified as a key employee with a COOP essential business process, or you have been identified as a risk steward for a DMAS division that going forward, one of the initiatives of this program will be to assess business change initiatives prior to implementation and have these risk stewards weighing in on how that change may impact their division, with the objective being to identify risks in advance prior to implementation of business changes so that we can ensure that those risks have been mitigated. A couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this, and so all attendees are muted for the presentation. However, if you have questions, please put those in the chat box. We will then follow up after the presentation with the presentation itself and a Q&A document that will answer those questions that you have. Additionally, as this is being recorded, those people that could not attend today will be required to view the recorded presentation. And as new personnel are being identified as risk liaisons or stewards, they also will be required to review the recorded presentation. If you look at slide 2, the objective, we're going to go over the agenda. We're going to discuss the objectives of the ARM program. We're going to talk about the risk management responsibilities and framework we'll be using at DMAS. We will talk through risks and controls and understanding those and writing those risk and control statements, identifying root cause. We'll talk about the walkthrough analysis and business change risk assessment process, or BCRA process, that we're going to be utilizing here at DMAS. We'll talk about risk event reporting. And then the last 2 bullets on here, questions for consideration during the walkthrough and analysis phase, and those process risk assessment factors are takeaways for you to think about as you're thinking about your business process. A lot of times those questions are things I ask myself when I'm evaluating a process. They are sometimes indicators of risk. And the risk assessment factors as well are things for you to think about and determine if you have those risk factors within your business. And then it also will allow you to risk rank those risk factors into a high, medium, and low ranking, and it gives you some guidelines there. So if you flip to slide 3, the objectives of the ARM program. So we are implementing this program at DMAS to help us meet a couple of the strategic goals. One is to ensure that we are adequately protecting the resources from fraud, waste, and abuse. So maintaining a good system of internal controls is important to meet that objective. We also want to ensure that Medicaid programs are operating as efficiently and effectively as possible, another strategic goal, so that we can ensure that Virginians are being provided with quality health care at all times. So we want to make sure we're identifying and then reacting to, through corrective action plans, identifying those risks that we see that could challenge us accomplishing those strategic goals. We also want to make sure that the mission essential functions that have been identified in the COOP are adequately protected with risks identified and then mitigated to ensure that they can continue operating efficiently and effectively and continually. We want to reduce internal and external audit findings that are related to repetitive issues that signify that we have risks that are being left unmitigated. We want to also drive accountability for risk and controls down to the line of business, educate DMAS as an agency on the importance of risks and controls and responsibilities related to that. We want to ensure we're identifying root cause correctly. A lot of times, improper root cause identification leads to repetitive audit issues. And then we also want to make sure that we're fostering communication across divisions. So sometimes business changes or initiatives occur, and people think about maybe risk within their own division, but not as it's being passed off to another division. And sometimes there could be gaps there in the pass off to other divisions.
Karen,
Yes.
can I please get you to advance the slide?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
You know,
okay.
I'm just talking along, aren't I?
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll be sending this out as I mentioned to everyone. All right. So on slide 5, the 3 lines of defense that are working together. This is the model that we're using at DMAS. Risk management is everybody's responsibility. ELT is responsible for ensuring that there's a strong tone at the top. And so you've probably heard that before along the way. Tone at the top is creating an environment in which employees feel comfortable to operate with ethics and integrity and to report areas or issues where they're seeing that that's not being followed. We do some things like that now with the code of conduct and conflict of interest, and we have hotlines and fraud lines for reporting. Um, it's important to know that we do have that culture in which, it's important that we are operating with ethics and integrity. At the bottom of that pyramid, the first line of defense is the business. And so the business segments need to understand that because they are closer to their process, that they should be responsible for identifying the risks that could threaten their process from being executed or from being able to align with the strategic objectives. The governance and oversight function, that would be the ARM program manager. So I will be providing governance and guidance, establishing policies, training, monitoring of first line of defense activities once we get started with those. And we'll talk a little bit later about how we're going to be doing that. And then third line of defense is internal, external auditors, sometimes program integrity, where they're coming in after the fact and assessing whether we still have risks that have been unmitigated or if the controls aren't functioning properly as well. So flipping to the next slide. So the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Enterprise Risk Management Framework. This is also a standard model that's utilized in a lot of organizations. This has been around in some form since the mid 80s. Recently, in 2017, they updated this framework to include strategy and objective setting. So those are the numeric 6 through 9. The governance and culture, what we just talked about with the tone at the top, that's 1 through 5, and making sure that we have that commitment to values and fostering that culture of ethics and integrity. Strategy and objective setting is making sure that your agency goals are being aligned to the business processes, and that your risk appetite has been defined so that the business processes can also then follow suit. Our activities that we'll be performing with the business and I will be assisting are 10 through 17. So we're going to talk in a little bit about how we're going to identify risks within the business processes and risk rank those, implementing risk responses and corrective action plans to make sure that we have controls in place to mitigate those risks. Then we'll be collectively viewing all of the business processes and the risks that we determine after those walkthroughs are performed to get an overall picture. We'll be reviewing business changes to determine how those are impacting the risk and controls environment, evaluating performance of the controls. And then as business is a fluid environment. You always are having to adapt accordingly. You have to revamp your risks. You may have to rewrite controls as your business changes. Information communication and reporting then will be reported out in a dashboard fashion at some point, monthly, quarterly, to be determined at this point. Okay, next few slides, we're going to talk about risks and controls. So what is a risk? I'm not going to read the definition because I think we probably all understand what a risk is. But I think what's important here is that within your business process, you need to always be thinking about what can go wrong within your business process. So what could be the impact? What could we do to prevent it? And also think about risk from the top down. What I mean by that is think about your business process first versus what controls you already have written or in place. And then align the controls you may have to those risks. But you may find that you have some risks that previously you did not have that currently don't have controls. If you think about it from the controls and then go backwards up to the risks, what I've seen sometimes is that businesses may not be identifying some risks that have emerged through business changes or other initiatives and things like that. So it's important to think about your business process first and then align those to the controls that you have in place. On the next slide, slide 9, when we identify a risk, then we are typically assessing that risk as a high, medium, or low impact. So you think about it as likelihood and impact, and it's a high, medium, or low, ranking. So if you have a risk that may have a very low impact, it may not be financially material, it may impact very few people, it may be a low impact. If the likelihood of that risk occurring is extremely low, then you can see on the chart here that that would be an overall low risk. Typically, violation of laws and regs, I typically think as a high impact because of reputational impact that could occur, fines or penalties that could occur with that. And, because we operate with a lot of regulations, there's a lot that we have to comply with. Likelihood at times may be high. So those may typically be high risk. There's 3 options that you can do to mitigate, avoid, or accept the risk. Mitigation is putting controls in place to mitigate the risk from occurring. Avoiding risk is just not performing that action altogether, or accepting the risk, which is typically done with just a low impact, low likelihood risk. Maybe if you have determined that remediating that risk doesn't outweigh the benefits of the risk. So at times, not often, but you may decide to risk accept. The next slide has some of the common risk categories here that you may have in your business process, you may not, and it's okay. Not everybody is going to have all of these. So third-party risk, for example, you may not utilize external vendors. So that may not be present within your process. A lot of times utilizing vendors, will introduce risk to your business process because we don't have control over how that process is being executed. We're monitoring a third party. At times we are using their reporting processes and things like that. So that introduces a risk. End user computing. I don't know if any business processes use Excel macros or spreadsheets to calculate numbers within their business process, but those Excel spreadsheets and macros sometimes can create loss due to erroneous calculations or changes. Compliance risk is the risk of loss due to violation of laws and regs. Fraud risk, you may or may not have that. A lot of times if you are dealing with cash or data information, PHI, then you could potentially have fraud risk and theft there of the asset or the information. Important to note on these on this slide are the two bullets at the bottom. Financial reporting risk and technology risk are both out of scope for this program. So currently, financial reporting risk, which is the risk that financial statements are not are materially misstated, that's accomplished currently through the ARMIX program, and the DMAS finance team reports that out to the DOA, who provides oversight over financial reporting risk. Technology risk is reported up to VITA through their Archer system. And so that also will be out of scope. The IM team is reporting that to VITA. We will touch on some elements of that. So we may be looking at system access within your process to ensure that, we do have controls over who can access data in PHI. But in general, system continuity and external data breaches will be reported out by the DMAS information management team. The next slide is talking about writing risk statements. And so I'm not going to read each one of these. I just tried to give some examples of what perhaps a poor description of a risk statement is versus a better description of risk. So on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is more a risk statement. It's really actually a restatement of the issue that was found, which is just really a symptom of the risk. So for example, system access reviews are not performed. That's the control that should be in place. The risk is that data privacy has been breached due to that control not being performed, that could result in financial losses related to compensatory fees and reputational damage. The bank reconciliation statement is not prepared. The risk is that misappropriation of company funds and possible fraud could occur due to the lack of segregation of duties and the reconciliation with external documents on the cash ledger. The next slide, we're talking about controls. So controls are manual, automated, a hybrid. They're preventive, they're detective. Preventive control is put in place to try to prevent the error from occurring. A detective control is put in place to identify if perhaps the error or risk is still occurring, and then taking extra measures to make sure that you are correcting those errors. Controls are automated. It could be a system edit check that's within our system that will prevent a type of transaction from occurring. It may be manual, where management has to sign off or review a bank statement or reconciliation. So there's different ways and types of controls out there. You want to make sure you're documenting the control with the elements of who is performing the control, as in the position, the employee's position, what the control activity is. For example, if it's a reconciliation, how often it's being performed, if it's monthly or daily, annually, quarterly, why you're performing the control, and then how you're documenting it if you've done a reconciliation. And then if you are, the preparer is initialing it and the approver is signing off, and perhaps you're saving it on the shared drive or another drive to evidence that that control was performed. It's important that we're documenting when the control takes place and saving the evidence that that control occurred, because down the road we will be testing controls to make sure that they are operating effectively. So that is important to do. Again, make sure that you are thinking about your risk and then flowing it down to the controls, because again, as business processes change, but controls stay stagnant, you then may not have been mitigating the risks that have been introduced or have changed within your business process, or the control may be stale and may no longer be designed effectively because the business process changed, but you didn't rewrite the control to change with it. So I've got some control examples on the next page. And again, I'm not going to read these, but just to note on the left-hand side, this is just a statement stating, that he reconciles the goods receipt note and purchase order, but it's not really saying why they're doing it. So why is evidence segregation of duties? When they're doing it daily, who is doing it, the AP supervisor, and what exactly they're doing. And so in a detailed fashion, they would be performing a three-way match, between the invoice, purchase order, and the purchase authorization. The point is to have it documented so that someone else could come in, understand that control as it's written, and then reperform that control too, and evaluate the control design. Page 14 discusses the common categories or a taxonomy of controls to think about and think about within your business process. So there are these type of controls in every process. You may not have all of them because you may not have systems that you're utilizing or physical inventory, so you wouldn't have system access reviews or physical inventory taking place. But a lot of times, these are different types of controls that you would use to mitigate some of the risks that you identify. So, for example, third parties, you might be performing site visits, or you would be having weekly or monthly phone calls and scorecards with them to discuss how they're performing against their service level agreements. If you are using systems, then you may be performing semi-annual or quarterly system access reviews to make sure that only those who need to have system access have that access to the data and can make changes to the data or have access to PHI. Segregation of duties is to ensure that not one person has overall control and that there's some checks and balances in place, either through oversight or management review, so that it's just a second set of eyes and assurance that that you have some checks and balances in place. Quality assurance a lot of times, so doing some random sampling of transactions to make sure that transactions are occurring as they should be. Exception reporting, running reports to ensure that either types of transactions, if they have occurred, that there is some oversight there to those types of transactions. The control testing objectives. So I mentioned that we'll be reviewing controls during the walkthrough analysis phase that we'll talk about in a minute. But the control objectives are to review the design effectiveness of that control. So making sure that that control is designed appropriately to mitigate the risk that it's being aligned to. And then ensuring that the control is operating effectively. So that would involve selecting a sample of that control. If it's an annual control, you would select the one annual control. If it's quarterly, you'd select one. If it's monthly, you'd select two. And then testing either through reperformance, that control to make sure that it was done properly and that it is indeed an effective control to mitigate the risk. So the types of control testing, I just mentioned reperformance. So you may be actually selecting the sample of controls, reperforming how that control was executed to ensure that it was done properly and in accordance with standard operating procedures. You may inspect the underlying documents. So from a bank reconciliation standpoint, you would want to see the support that accompanies that, either the bank statement or the general ledger printout of the cash accounts, and review that evidence as well. Observation, maybe reviewing screenshots or discussion notes, things like that, where you're actually physically watching someone doing a process. If it's a systematic process, you may have to watch over their shoulder to make sure that the system is functioning as, the standard operating procedure state. And then, of course, there's inquiry. And so usually you start a walkthrough with discussing the business process with those business owners, reading the standard operating procedures and policies and procedures as well, to get an understanding of the process and how it's written on paper. And then you're actually performing a walkthrough and some reinspection and control testing to ensure that the actual process is occurring as written. It's important to note that inquiry alone does not provide evidence that the control operated through the period. So, again, we use inquiry to get background knowledge, but that is not sufficient evidence to determine if a control is operated effectively. Root cause. So again, on the left, an incorrect description. These are just restatements of the issue that was found, and not actually driving to why the issue occurred. And identifying root cause is not to put blame on someone or to call someone out. It's just trying to determine why the error occurred, and just try to prevent it from occurring again. So it may be that there was some staffing turnover and they weren't aware of the policies and procedures, or perhaps policies and procedures didn't exist. So both of those could be rationale. You could have staffing shortages. So perhaps that could be why control wasn't being performed, or there could have been a gap in the time frame that the control was being performed. So those are the types of rationale for root cause analysis. And so it's important to really drive to determining what root cause analysis is, so that you can then put in a corrective action plan to remediate the issue from occurring. Walkthrough testing and assessment, the WTA life cycle. So that is the process that we're going to be using at DMAS starting next year for those mission essential functions. So we'll be performing a process risk assessment on those processes to risk rank high, medium, and low, and then determine a cyclical time frame for those that have been ranked in each of those buckets. We'll be performing a process walkthrough then with a representative sample of one, to then evidence how the process works and ensure that the process is operating in accordance with standard operating procedures and policies and procedures. We'll be evaluating the risks and controls that have been identified through the process walkthrough, and evaluating that control design and risk assessment. We'll then be performing some control testing of those controls that have been identified, and again, based on whether they're annual, quarterly, monthly, or daily, selecting a sample and doing a review or reperformance of those controls. And then after the fact, doing a risk and control self-assessment to determine what the residual risk is after you have assessed the risks, and then how appropriate the controls have been designed and how effective those controls are in mitigating that risk. Those results then will be being reported out through me to ELT, and we'll be doing some dashboard reporting on the risks and controls to the agency as a whole. This slide talks a little bit about the control environment, and just again challenging the control environment during the WTA activities. And so, it's just making sure that you're evaluating whether those controls are appropriate. Have they indeed been aligned to the risk that you've identified? Are they really mitigating that risk? Um, is the frequency of the control adequate to actually mitigate the risk? If you're performing something daily, but you only do the control annually, probably not an adequate frequency. So you just want to make sure that you're challenging that control environment and adapting your controls to your business process as your business process changes. So, I've been in organizations before where controls have been written and, year over year, they're rubber stamped, even though the business process has changed year over year. And after a few years, the controls that are there no longer mitigate any of the risks that are existing within the business process. So it's something that does have to remain fluid as well because your business process is fluid. The walkthrough of one transaction, as I mentioned, is a representative transaction that will be traced through from beginning to end. We call it cradle to grave. And we want to do that because it helps sometimes to identify where there could be interdependencies between divisions or systems. And it uh, helps to identify the applications that are being utilized as well. And it highlights sometimes the risks that are there and related controls, whether they are or not in place. So that's typically what is performed as a walkthrough in the walkthrough and analysis phase. So I mentioned the business change risk assessment or BCRA and that process that is an objective of this program. And it's just to help provide transparency across divisions so that divisions do have some insight into new initiatives or business changes that are occurring in other areas that perhaps the other areas may not have thought there were any downstream effects to their business changes. So, having some of the representatives from other divisions weigh in, whether it's just to say, nope, no impact, or yeah, this is actually going to change the way, I have to do this or that, or it may change this control, or it's going to introduce this risk into my business process. It's just to make sure that we're thinking about risk throughout the agency with the business change and making sure that we're identifying those risks up front. We have a template that we'll be utilizing that I think I've sent that out to the LT members to have the risk steward identified for the differing areas. And those will be being circulated out to those risk areas, risk stewards, as the business risks are being identified so that they can weigh in on if there is any new risk being introduced into their area, and then what the corrective action plan would be to mitigate that risk. Risk event reporting, and this will be something new as well. And again, it's just to provide some visibility across divisions and up through the agency of risk events that may have occurred within your business that we want to make sure that everybody at the ELT level is aware of, and of course that the agency is aware of potentially multiple risks that have happened. It could be a financially significant loss that occurred within your process. It could be a violation of laws and regs, perhaps an external audit finding that came up within a review, or a major vendor who's not performing in accordance with their service level agreements. All of these things that could introduce risk to the agency, that could put the agency at risk for not receiving federal funding, or could put us financially at risk if you have 10 events that are reported through 10 different divisions and then conglomerated that could signify a large material loss for the agency. So we're just trying to, again, provide transparency there to the risk events that are occurring that you may know of, and want to make sure that that's being funneled up so that at the higher up, we can mitigate those risks as we have been seeing them reported. So the last 2 slides, or 3 slides, I guess, on here are, as I mentioned, questions for consideration. If you're answering yes to some of these questions, as you should think about these questions within your business process. Then you've probably got risk in your business process that you want to make sure is being mitigated. If you're using key vendors, you want to make sure that you're reviewing their SOC report, that you can get the SOC report, that you are performing site visits and assessment of their performance to the SLAs. You want to make sure that you have policies and procedures and standard operating procedures for your business process, especially if you're a mission essential function for the COOP. They're very important to have. If you've had a lot of business change within your structure, if you're using key applications, those are all indicating that you have risk within your area. And then you should be thinking then, okay, how have I mitigated those risks? Am I doing system access reviews to ensure that only appropriate people have access to the information, the key applications? Am I doing reconciliations if I've got one system that's passing information off to another system? Am I making sure that it's being passed off completely and accurately through some type of system reconciliation? All of those questions then you can think about as part of your business and determine then if you've got the appropriate controls in place. The last couple of slides here just go through on the left some type of risk factors that you may have. So reputational risk, if something went wrong within your business, would you have a large swath of people that would be impacted, or a very small representative group of people? That could then help you risk rank if you have a high risk versus a low risk regarding reputational damage. Susceptibility to fraud, the same, you may not have anything, as I mentioned before, with cash or PHI or anything like that. But if you do, typically those are highly susceptible to fraud and theft of data, theft of cash. And so that may be a high risk. If not, you may have no or low risk related to that. As I mentioned, external vendors. If you have a lot of vendors, you have strong reliance, then you may have high risk in your business process. Or if you don't rely on suppliers at all, then it may be a very low risk or no risk at all. History of issues and deficiencies from audits typically implies high risk because it would imply that you don't have a strong control structure within your business process versus those that when they're audited, they have very few issues or deficiencies. So the implication is that there's a strong control structure there. So those are takeaways, these last few slides for you to think about and consider as well for your business process to help you just think about risk and foster that thought process. This program is new, and so, I think we all probably think about risk in a roundabout way, but it may not be, it's not currently well documented as we're striving to do going forward. So again, if you do have questions down the road, reach out to me. And then if you have questions on the slide presentation today, you can put those in the chat. And as I mentioned, I'll be following up with the presentation after this training, as well as a Q&A document to answer those questions as well. And that will conclude the presentation today. I do appreciate everyone attending. Thanks so much, and we will give you about 15 minutes time back. Thanks again.